On the foggy morning of May 27, 1905, Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky stood on the bridge of the battleship Knyaz Suvorov, peering through his binoculars at the Japanese fleet forming a perfect line across his path. He had just sailed 18,000 miles over 7 months to reach this moment. His men were dying of tropical diseases, his ships were held together with prayers and coal dust, and half his crew had gone mad from the journey. In precisely 45 minutes, the decisive phase of the battle would be over, and almost his entire fleet would be doomed. This is the story of the most catastrophically doomed naval expedition in human history. The Russian Baltic Fleet's journey to Tsushima wasn't just a military defeat. It was a comedy of errors so absurd that if it weren't documented in excruciating detail, you'd think it was fiction. We're talking about sailors who shot at their own ships, threw their binoculars overboard believing they were cursed, and mistook British fishing boats for Japanese torpedo boats, while sailing near England. By the end of this video, you'll understand why naval historians call this the most humiliating defeat in maritime history, and why one Japanese admiral needed just 45 minutes to secure victory over what took Russia 7 months and 18,000 miles to deliver. The story begins with a surprise that shocked the world. On February 8, 1904, Japanese torpedo boats launched a sneak attack on the Russian Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur without declaring war. The Russians woke up to explosions and chaos. Within hours, their Pacific Fleet was crippled. Tsar Nicholas II, who had dismissed Japan as a nation of monkeys, suddenly faced a crisis. Russia's Far Eastern Empire was under threat, and their only major naval force in the Pacific was trapped in port. Before we dive into the unbelievable journey that followed, make sure you hit subscribe and the notification bell. Now, let's return to the Tsar's desperate solution. The solution seemed logical to the Tsar's advisors. Send the Baltic Fleet halfway around the world to crush the Japanese Navy. After all, Russia was a European power with centuries of naval tradition. Japan had only modernized its navy in the last 30 years. How hard could it be? The man chosen to lead this expedition was Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky, a competent officer known for his volcanic temper and inability to delegate. He took one look at his fleet and reportedly said, "Half these ships should be in museums, not combat." He wasn't wrong. The fleet that departed Kronstadt on October 15, 1904, was a floating disaster waiting to happen. It consisted of 4 new battleships, which were decent, mixed with ancient coastal defense ships never designed for ocean voyages. The Oriole was so top-heavy, it nearly capsized in calm seas. The Navarin had engines that broke down if you looked at them wrong. Most crews had never sailed beyond the Baltic Sea. The officers were political appointees who bought their commissions. One captain was notorious for being drunk by noon every day. Another had never commanded anything larger than a river barge. But the real problem started before they even left Russian waters. The fleet's departure was supposed to be a glorious patriotic moment. Instead, the Oral, Eagle, ran aground in front of the watching crowds. It took 6 hours to refloat her. According to sailor folklore, during the blessing ceremony, a priest dropped his crucifix in the water, considered the worst possible omen by the superstitious crews. As they finally departed, the battleship Borodino accidentally rammed a tugboat, sinking it. They hadn't even reached the open sea yet. The voyage's first major disaster came in the North Sea. On the night of October 21st, the fleet was passing the Dogger Bank fishing grounds. Russian intelligence had warned that Japanese torpedo boats were planning an ambush, never mind that Japan had no boats anywhere near Europe. When the Russian lookouts spotted small vessels in the fog, panic erupted. "Torpedo boats!" someone screamed. The entire fleet opened fire. For 10 minutes, Russian battleships unleashed everything they had at the Japanese attackers. When the fog cleared, they discovered they had been firing on British fishing trawlers. The Hull fishing fleet had been dragging for cod. The Russians had managed to sink 1 trawler, damage 6 others, kill 2 fishermen, wound 6 more, and, in a spectacular display of incompetence, also hit 2 of their own ships. The cruiser Aurora took 5 hits from friendly fire, killing the ship's chaplain. The British were not amused. The Royal Navy mobilized, ready to sink the entire Russian fleet. Only frantic diplomacy prevented war. The fleet's journey down the African coast became a descent into madness. They couldn't use the Suez Canal. Britain controlled it and wasn't letting them through after the fishing boat incident. So they had to go around Africa, adding thousands of miles to their journey. The tropical heat was unbearable. Ships designed for the Baltic were like ovens. Temperatures in the engine rooms reached extreme levels. Sailors reported conditions so hot that men collapsed and died at their posts. The ventilation systems designed for cold weather pumped hot air into already stifling compartments. But the coal situation was the real nightmare. The fleet needed approximately 300,000 tons of coal for the journey. Every few days they had to stop and refuel from German colliers in neutral ports. Coaling was hell. In tropical heat, crews had to manually load hundreds of tons of coal. The coal dust mixed with sweat created a black paste that got into everything: food, water, lungs. Men looked like mining disasters. After each coaling, dozens collapsed from heat exhaustion. The ships became so filthy that tropical diseases spread like wildfire. The animal situation might be the most insane aspect of this voyage, though how much is fact and how much is sailor legend is hard to determine. Officers definitely brought pets. Dogs, cats, parrots are documented. But according to fleet folklore in Madagascar, things got out of hand. Sailors supposedly bought exotic animals as mascots. The stories claim ships soon had crocodiles, snakes, monkeys, and one tale even mentions a tiger. The monkey population allegedly exploded and spread to other ships. Poisonous snakes were said to have escaped into ventilation systems. Whether every detail is true or not, the ships definitely became floating menageries that added to the chaos. Discipline completely collapsed. In Madagascar, where they spent 2 months, crews went on drunken rampages. Local rum was cheap and potent. Sailors traded military equipment for alcohol. One group allegedly sold an entire ship's lifeboat for rum. Officers lost control. Men refused orders. Several ships reported near mutinies. Admiral Rozhestvensky's solution? He banned shore leave and doubled the punishments. This went about as well as you'd expect. One of the most telling incidents, possibly embellished by retelling, involved the repair ship Kamchatka and their binoculars. According to fleet legend, sailors became convinced their binoculars were cursed. Every time someone used them to spot another ship, that ship would have an accident. The crew, driven to superstition by heat and fear, supposedly staged a secret ritual where they threw all the binoculars overboard at midnight. Whether this specific incident happened or not, the Kamchatka was definitely notorious for incompetence and would spend the voyage sending false alarms about non-existent Japanese attacks. Disease ravaged the fleet. Tropical infections, coal dust pneumonia, heat stroke, and dysentery killed more men than the Japanese would. The hospital ship was overwhelmed. Bodies were thrown overboard daily. Funerals became so common they stopped holding ceremonies. The psychological toll was worse. Sailors hallucinated from heat and exhaustion. They saw Japanese torpedo boats in every wave. Ghost stories spread through the fleet. Men claimed to see the spirits of dead comrades warning of doom. The fleet's communication system broke down completely. Ships couldn't maintain formation. The Kamchatka became notorious for sending the signal, "Do you see torpedo boats?" every few hours, causing fleet-wide panic. Once, they signaled that they were being chased by 3 Japanese battleships. When asked for their position, they replied, "Not sure, but the Japanese ships are gone now." They had been fleeing from a Swedish merchant vessel. Admiral Rozhestvensky allegedly threw his binoculars at the officer who delivered this message. As they rounded Africa and headed toward their doom, morale hit rock bottom. Letters from home brought news of revolution brewing in Russia. The men realized they were sailing to die for a Tsar who might not even be in power when they arrived. Officers found anti-Tsarist pamphlets circulating among crews. Several plots to assassinate Rozhestvensky were discovered. He slept with loaded pistols and trusted no one. When they finally approached Japanese waters in May 1905, the fleet was a shadow of itself. Ships were held together with makeshift repairs. Engines wheezed and failed. Gun mechanisms were clogged with coal dust. Crews were decimated by disease and exhaustion. They had traveled 18,000 miles over 7 months. Admiral Togo's Japanese fleet, meanwhile, had been waiting, rested, maintained, and prepared. They had spent months training for this exact battle, Togo had every advantage. He knew exactly where the Russians would go. They had to pass through the Tsushima Strait to reach Vladivostok. His ships were faster, better maintained, and manned by crews who hadn't spent 7 months slowly going insane in tropical heat. Most importantly, he had been drilling one specific maneuver over and over, crossing the T. This naval tactic would allow him to bring all his guns to bear, while the Russians could only fire their forward weapons. The battle began at 2:45 p.m. on May 27th. Togo executed his plan perfectly. The Japanese battle line crossed in front of the Russian column, bringing devastating fire onto the lead Russian ships. The Knyaz Suvorov, with Admiral Rozhestvensky aboard, took concentrated fire from the entire Japanese battle line. Within minutes, she was ablaze. The Admiral was wounded by shell fragments, his skull fractured. Command passed to Admiral Nebogotov, then to Enquist, creating chaos in the chain of command. The Russian gunnery was abysmal. Exhausted crews, fouled gun mechanisms, and poor quality shells meant most shots missed entirely. When they did hit, many shells failed to explode. The fuses had deteriorated during the tropical voyage. Japanese shells, meanwhile, were devastating. They used new high-explosive shells that turned Russian superstructures into infernos. The Oslyabbya became the first modern battleship sunk by gunfire alone, going down in 30 minutes with 500 men. By 3:30 p.m., just 45 minutes after the battle began, the decisive phase was over. 4 Russian battleships were sinking or sunk. The flagship was a burning wreck. The fleet's formation had disintegrated into chaos. Ships collided trying to avoid torpedoes. Some fired on their own vessels in the smoke and confusion. The Borodino exploded when a shell hit her magazine, killing all but one of her 855 crew. The explosion was visible 60 miles away. Though fighting would continue through the night, the outcome was already determined. As darkness fell, Japanese torpedo boats moved in to finish the destruction. The Russians, exhausted and demoralized, could barely defend themselves. Ships surrendered rather than fight. The Badovi, carrying the wounded Rozhestvensky, surrendered to a single Japanese destroyer. The mighty Russian fleet that had sailed halfway around the world was reduced to scattered, burning wrecks. By morning, it was over. The numbers tell the story of the catastrophe. Russia lost 34 ships, 21 sunk, 7 captured, 6 interned in neutral ports. Only 3 ships reached Vladivostok. Russian casualties exceeded 5,000 dead and 6,000 captured. The Japanese lost 3 torpedo boats and 117 men. It was the most lopsided naval defeat in modern history. The Russian Baltic Fleet had sailed 18,000 miles to deliver itself for destruction. Admiral Rozhestvensky survived, was captured, and later court-martialed. At his trial, he took full responsibility, but added, "I was ordered to sail to the other side of the world with a fleet that should never have left the Baltic." He was acquitted. Many officers were not so lucky. Some were rumored to have been shot by their own crews during the battle, though these stories are difficult to verify. Others committed suicide rather than surrender. The consequences went far beyond naval defeat. News of Tsushima triggered massive unrest that contributed to the 1905 Russian Revolution. The Tsar's prestige never recovered. Japan emerged as a major world power, the first Asian nation to defeat a European power in modern warfare. The racial assumptions of European superiority were shattered. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany wrote, "The consequences of this battle are immeasurable. The tragedy is that everyone except the Tsar knew this fleet was doomed." British observers who watched them depart gave them no chance. The French naval attaché wrote, "They sailed to sacrifice." Even Japanese Admiral Togo was said to have expressed sympathy before the battle for the fleet that had come so far to meet destruction, though this may be later romanticization. The Russian sailors knew it too. Letters home showed they expected death. One wrote, "We are sailing on our own funeral ships." So ended the most catastrophic naval expedition ever attempted. 18,000 miles, 7 months of suffering, only to be annihilated in a battle whose outcome was decided in 45 minutes. The Russian Baltic Fleet's journey to Tsushima remains history's greatest example of military hubris meeting reality. They sailed halfway around the world to prove European superiority and instead proved that competence, not race, wins battles. What's the most unbelievable part of this doomed voyage to you? The fishing boat attack? The monkey-infested ships? Or just the sheer stupidity of the entire plan? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more military disasters and other weird stories from the past, stay tuned for our next videos. The truth about Thermopylae will blow your mind. Remember to subscribe and hit the bell. Until next time, be grateful you'll never have to sail 18,000 miles in a floating zoo filled with drunk sailors, poisonous snakes, and the smell of impending doom. Some journeys are better left untaken.